This is the Graduate Institute CEPR series on COVID economics. Today we're very happy to have Francesco Lippi from LUIS, who is presenting a paper co-authored with Fernando Alvarez from Chicago and David Argente from Penn State. Fernando and David are also online, so that's great. And the paper is titled A Simple Planning Problem for COVID-19 Lockdown, Testing and Tracing. So Francesco will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll take Q&A from the public. You can ask your questions using the Q&A tabs. If there is some quick clarifying questions, since we have Fernando and David online, they can quickly, if it's something easy to answer online, they can answer directly in the Q&A tab. If not, we move it to the end, or I can either interrupt Francesco, or we can move it to the end of the presentation. And you know, all the end of the presentation, if you would like to ask a question live instead of typing, just raise your hand and we'll give you the microphone. So I guess without further ado, I can give the floor to Francesco.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, and let me also take the occasion to thank CEPR, and in particular, I'd like to thank Charles Wiplos, who pushed us, you know, to join this group and to continue working on this paper early on. This is a paper that we started working on in March, when the problem of the COVID really broke out. And there were initially a lot of early contributions, mostly from the epidemiological experts, of course, as it is natural for such a problem, but it soon became clear that this problem goes well beyond the epidemiologists because of the measures that were taken to deal with it, essentially the lockdown, mandating people to stay home, as obvious and sizable economic consequences. So we started thinking about this, how would you regulate? You know, this seems like a very basic, sort of quintessentially economic problem. You have two bad things and you want to have not too much of any of those. So you have to trade off the costs that are due to the deaths caused by the lockdown with the economic costs, because obviously those are also sizable. And so here's what we do. We started, like, very simply by taking an off-the-shelf SIR model, one of those epidemiological models where the population is divided into types, and types are initially susceptible, those who haven't gotten the disease. Then through some contacts with an infected agent, they will become infected, and they get out of the infection with some rate at some given velocity, either as recovered agents or dead agents. And so this is a very nice model from the 1930s. It's very simple, but it's sort of, we use it as to get a first pass on, you know, what are the main building blocks conceptually that one needs to write down to think of this problem in a little bit systematic way. And also, you know, as economists, one of the first things you want to consider in thinking of such a problem is whether you want to solve this problem as a planner's problem, or whether you want to model the individual agent's behavior, because naturally in the epidemiological model, there are some parameters that describe how agents interact and how active they are. And those parameters are treated in our approach sort of as given, and that's not what economists do. Many of other colleagues, you know, like I'm thinking of Greg Yarosh, Rob Scheimer, and many others are thinking about the question of how would agents individually choose to respond to this. We sidestep this issue. We want to look at what an optimal policy will be. And therefore, since the problem is externalities, we directly look and solve the planner's problem. Okay, so what is the planner's problem? Well, this planner is going to have a trade-off, as I mentioned, between the value of economic activity. Every time you enter a lockdown, you're slowing down economic activity, and that's not good. On the other hand, this may bring some benefits in terms of reduced infection rates, and therefore you're saving lives. So there is a trade-off between this blue object and the red object. And what our paper does, on top of this basic SIR model, which I will describe in the next slide, is really consider three major conceptual blocks to sort of explore how the optimal policy would differ depending on, let me call it, technologies, on the conditions that the planner is facing. And the first effect that we allow the model to describe is a congestion effect. We heard a lot about this when the epidemic broke out. Initially, people wanted to flatten the curve. And a simple rationale for flattening the curve is the idea that your hospitals may only have capacity to deal with so many infected people at one point in time. So you don't want everybody to go to the hospital at the same time. And the way we model this is by assuming that the fatality rate, this object that will be called phi, there will be a function phi, it will depend on the number of infected agents. So, the probability that you die conditional on being infected depends on how many people are infected. That's why I'm trying to, I'm beginning to feed you with the important model objects. There is this kappa variable. When kappa is 0, this case fatality rate is a constant fraction, say 1% of the infected die. If kappa is bigger than 0, the case fatality rate will be increasing in the fraction of infected agents. So we will explore how different degrees of congestion of the healthcare system will affect the optimal policy by playing around with the kappa. Second, we will consider how the optimal lockdown policy changes according to whether the planner has access to an antibody test, that's when tau is equal to 1, or does not have access to an antibody test. What is the difference? Well, under the assumption that if the agent has antibodies, he is immune to the disease, so he cannot get it a second time, having an antibody test allows the planner to release from the lockdown the recovered agent, the survival recovered agent, which is great because then the lockdown is less inefficient. Some people can go back to work. Instead, when there is no antibody test, as was the case, for instance, in Italy and still largely is, when we were in a lockdown, if the lockdown is called upon, everybody has to be home, even though in principle, some people could be immune to the disease and could get out. And thirdly, we will also solve the problem under the assumption that the policymaker has access to a technology that we call a TTQ, a smart test, trace, and quarantine. And these policies, will be injected together with the lockdown. But in some sense, it's sort of its mirror image because it's a policy of selectively identifying in the population the agents that are infected and pulling them out of the group and placing them in quarantine, maybe in their homes. And it's interesting for us, we heard a lot about this policy, more or less in an intuitive way. I think Paul Romer was one of the advocate of, pursuing this policy, and we will model it. And a key aspect of this policy will be how good the technology is to, first of all, find the infected in the large population. Imagine, the United States, 300 million, and you have to find like maybe 0.1% of infected. It's, if you're good at finding them, great. Otherwise, it's a nightmare. I mean, it's going to be very costly to search at random. So the parameter zeta in this part of the policy and big T is a capacity constraint. How many people are you able to test? So when big T will be 0, there will be basically no TTQ policy available to the planner. So, our plan here is to adopt a basic SIR model and enrich it slowly with 1, 2, and 3 of these technologies, 1, 2, 3. And the goal is to, to identify what are the main determinants given an environment, for instance, an environment with a certain degree of congestion, with or without an antibody test, with or without a test, tracing, quarantine policy. we want to study what does the optimal lockdown policy looks like. Okay, so, and we will study the optimal lockdown, as I said, with or without tests, with or without TTQ. And also, finally, I want to mention that we're going to look at this thing we call anticipation, which actually this was suggested to us by Andy Atkinson, and I will go back to it. We thought it's a very interesting and important assumptions to understand what happened in reality, because basically the policies, we start today, there is an outbreak, we don't really have the technology today we deal with the outbreak. For instance, we don't have a vaccine or we don't have an antibody test, but somehow we know that this better technology will arrive in 6 months or in 2 months. And then we want to study these dynamic complementarities. You know, how would you change your policy today if you know that in sometime in the future, something better will arrive? So these are very important, we think, to kind of think through what happened in practice. And the model allows us to quantify the welfare costs in terms of lost GDP and lost lives, and map lives into GDP by using a value of a statistical life approach. This first slide is a summary of the SIR model. Essentially, the whole population NT is divided in 3 groups: susceptible, infected, and recovered. And the key to this model is the way, you know, is these 2 differential equations, S dot and I dot. So this is, you know, it's a continuous time. So this is a time derivative of the variable big S, which is the number of the susceptible. And you can see all the parameters are positive. At each point in time, the number of the susceptible is reduced because some of them become infected. And the specific mechanism through which they become infected depends on this parameter beta. Essentially, it is as if each I agent infects beta S susceptible. So beta is a measure of how infectious the disease is. And then when you integrate over all the I agent, you get this kind of quadratic formula that the number of total new infection is given by S times I. And of course, these agents move out of the group of susceptible and move in the group of the infected. That's where it is. And at the same time, the infected go down at the rate gamma, which is, you know, the exit rate. So if, you know, this is some constant hazard. So if you think that the duration of the disease is roughly 18 days, gamma will be something like 1/18. So in daily terms. So that 1/gamma is 18 days. And that's the basic SIR model. In the bottom of the slide, you see the mechanics, the equation for those that die. A certain fraction of the infected, IT, die at each point in time. That's the function phi of I. And this function phi of I, as I mentioned before, we parameterize it in a way that allows it to be nonlinear. Or in this particular case, you know, linearly increasing in I. So if kappa is 0, a constant fraction var phi of the infected die, think about it like 1%. 1% is a bit on the high side, but I'll discuss parameters later. But you may want to model congestion effects so that this rate phi of I is increasing in I. That's how we do it.
Francesco,
so, yes.
Just a quick clarifying question. Are you going to discuss something about the reliability of the test, or just assume that they are 100% reliable?
We will assume that they are 100% reliable. Yeah. We will make a lot of assumptions. I mean, like, to me, one of the main assumptions we're making that is, you know, if you ask me one thing I would like to change, we, as a start, because this problem is more tricky than it seems, but as a start, we will assume that the whole population and the parameters are constant across the population. I think we know, we have very strong evidence that the fatality rate differs greatly across age categories, across, so for instance, you know, the elderly are much more at risk. So there's nothing of that. So this is like really, it says in the title, it's a simple first step. So how do we change this setup? First of all, we start by introducing lockdown. What is the lockdown? So now on the slide, you see the same equations we had before, but there's some brownish stuff. What is this brownish stuff? Well, for the moment, let me assume that theta is 1. I'll tell you about theta later. So LT is the control of the policymaker. It's basically the fraction of the population that the policymaker places in lockdown, okay? So LT is a number in between 0 and 1. If it is 0, we are back to the previous scenario, nothing changes. If it is 1, basically the policymaker is mandating everybody to stay home. And when everybody stays home, or let's say when 1 minus L, when a fraction L of the population stays home, a fraction 1 minus L is out. And that's why now the contagion is reduced, and is reduced to the square, because you have 1 minus L times 1 minus L, less interactions, less contacts in the population. Now, I will just briefly mention that this quadratic form is going to turn out to be very powerful, like it's known in search models, just because, you know, basically by reducing, say you mandate half of the population to stay home, you're essentially reducing the interactions by 1/2 to the square. So you reduce it by 1/4. Now, that's very mechanical. So the lockdown directly affects the law of motion of the propagation by affecting interactions. Now, the theta is a parameter we use to recognize that no lockdown is perfect, because even if you mandate people to stay home, you know, if they live in a condominium, they're still taking the same elevator, perhaps meeting in the hallway and shaking hands, doing their groceries, etc. So theta is a parameter that if it is 1, it's assumed that the lockdown is perfectly efficient. But if it is 0, it would assume people don't go to work, but they still have a lot of interactions, I don't know, in the pub or somewhere, or in the park. So we will start by assuming somewhere in between, like a theta of 0.5, just to model imperfect effectiveness of the lockdown. Okay, and then the third technology that we will consider, I'm going to say more about the serological test in a moment, but the third technology is tracing, testing, and quarantine. I want to discuss it now because it directly affects the law of motion of the infection. How does it work? The idea is very simple. If you are able to find an infected agent in the population, and then you place it into the quarantine. So Q is a stock of agents in quarantine, is a stock of infected agents in quarantine. So Q can never be bigger than I. I mean, ideally, if you manage to stock all the I agents into quarantine, I minus Q is 0, and therefore you have no more infections. Well, that's obvious because there's nobody infected around. So I minus Q is really the measure of the infected agents not in quarantine. So we understand by looking at these equations that placing agents in quarantine is a good idea if you only knew how to do it, because you basically take them out of the population and you know, they stay home, they do their business, they recover, and the problem is solved. And so how do you place people into quarantine? There's an equation here that tells you that every period you can trace and quarantine up to T agents. So T is the number of new agents that are sent into quarantine. Of course, you'll have to find them. So we'll get back to this. And then at every moment in time, you know, like before, a certain fraction gamma times Q also leaves the quarantine because they recover. Okay, so this quarantine, this TTQ problem is essentially like before, but you replace the measure I by a measure I minus Q. And it will be crucial to know, you know, how costly it is to input these T agents per period into this stock Q. Okay, so what is given this dynamic system, it's a dynamical system of 2 or 3 differential equations, right? 3 in this case, because we have the S dot, the I dot, and the Q dot. This is equivalent to the law of motion of, you know, the system in our, say, the growth model. Now there is a planner who's kind of maximizing some objective, and here's, or minimizing this objective, and here's what the objective is. So the planner is choosing, okay, first, let me forget about the TTQ. So let's begin from a simpler problem where there is only the lockdown policy. And there is a lockdown policy under the assumption that you either have a serological test, an antibody test. So when tau is 1, the planner has an antibody test, which means that the people who recovered do not need to stay home in lockdown. The people who went through the disease and recovered can go back to work. Or a setting which you don't have the serological test and everybody has to be in lockdown. So lockdown applies to the whole of the population. And what is the objective? The objective is to minimize, to choose the LT with the objective to minimize what? These are the flow losses. These blue and red objects are the flow losses. And then, this is a present value, present discounted at rate R plus nu. I'm going to tell you what it is in a second. So let me walk you through the GDP losses. GDP losses, in case tau is 0, so there is no antibody test, it means that lockdown applies to the whole population, which means that this square parenthesis is just the number 1. That is, if you lock down half of the population, you lose half of the GDP. W is GDP per capita. So think of these losses as in per capita terms. Okay, that's a difference with having a serological test, because notice that if tau is 1, this square bracket is not the number 1, is S plus I. So it's a fraction of the population. So think of S and I as fractions of the total population. So normalized by, let me normalize the total population to 1. And that's good because S plus I is a number smaller than 1. So with the serological test, the lockdown is a bit less costly because it doesn't apply to the recovered. Now, in the red term, what we have is the cost for the planner due to the deaths in each period. This is per unit of time. So it's a fraction phi of IT, of the stock IT, multiplied by a parameter that is the value of a statistical life. So we are using here results from, well, there's some classic literature in economics on the value of statistical lives, and in particular, there's a paper that in Spirit is inspired us by Murphy and Topel in JPE, I think 2006, where you want to measure how valuable is the residual, is, when a person dies, how valuable is to this person the value of the foregone consumption that would have occurred. So by its definition, this measure will depend a lot on the concavity of preferences, because you basically have to give a whole lot of utility in just one period. So if utility is very curved, this value of statistical life will be a big multiple of the lost of the foregone income. And also it will depend on the residual life. If you die at age 99, probably you didn't have a lot of residual life. If you die at age 40, this is going to be a bigger number because you're forgiving a bigger. So we also relate, actually we use sort of a more, of a recent contribution on the value of statistical life related to COVID by Pete Clino, Chad Jones, and Bob Hall, who sort of have a note where they discuss what VSLs would make sense in the context of this problem. We'll explore a range of them. Sorry, I'm sorry. I will discuss it shortly. So given this objective function, the planner is minimizing this value, this present value, subject to the law of motion of S and I. And in the problem where we'll introduce the tracing and quarantines, there will also be another differential equation for Q. Okay, so we're now all set. I mean, I could spend maybe 1 minute mentioning that the way you solve this, you can think of Bellmanizing it, or writing down a Bellman equation, value function B as a function of S and I. The state of this problem is two-dimensional. The system, the position of the system and its dynamics are fully described once you know how many susceptible and how many infected you have. So this is a value function over defined in R square. Now here I wrote basically the Hamiltonian. There is the period return and the Lagrangian, the law of motions for the two partial derivatives of the value function. Now, there are some technical aspects of this problem that are easy to see, and also they're useful in solving the problem. So when there is no infected, so if we think of this, of that line of the Cartesian plane where I is equal to 0, the value function is 0. There is no cost, there is no infected, there is no problem. That's kind of trivial. So there's a boundary condition. And also it's pretty trivial to solve the problem once there are no susceptible anymore. At that point, you know, you have so many infected and all you have to do is to compute the present value of these deaths. So somehow the perimeter, where two sides of this feasible region of the state space are easy to characterize. What is tricky is that this value function in the neighborhood of 0 will be very steep. Because, you know, if you have epsilon infected, the problem may actually be pretty serious if S is high. And that's what makes the solution of this problem analytical, a rigorous solution to this problem kind of tricky. So we spent a lot of time carefully solving this problem, which is also non-concave, so you cannot apply the standard methods like a first order approach would suggest. So once we are endowed with the problem, of course, the key step is how to parameterize it. So let me walk you through the parameterizations we chose. Some of the parameters are taken from the epidemiological studies. I mentioned that this paper was written, the current version was written in the early April, I think these parameters. Now we learned a little bit more, we're revising it, and we're changing some of those. For instance, the beta, the transmission rate, is beta. We think a bit smaller beta would make more sense. We have an R0, you know, the rate at which infection grow at the initial, at the beginning of the epidemic, that is a bit too high, like it's bigger than 3. And we're basically thinking of cutting this into half. But anyway, these are the parameters that you will see in today's experiment. So each infected person infects basically 5 people, and the gamma you get out of the disease in 18 days. Phi is the fatality rate. This is also a bit on the pessimistic side. We assume 1% of the infected eventually die. This is probably a little high, even though, as I mentioned, it varies a lot by age groups. But and kappa is a parameter that is very difficult to discipline because we have very little evidence about it. And we, like other studying this problem, I'm thinking of Marty Eichenbaum and co-authors, and Daron Acemoglu, Ivan Werning, and co-authors, sort of think of a maximum of the peak of the fatality rate when you have, say, 10% of the population infected, and backtrack a value for kappa from there. For instance, here we assume, again, probably a bit too pessimistically, a peak fatality rate of 3%, or here with a 40% infected. So these are the epidemiological parameters. Then there are some economic parameters. So there is a discount rate, the usual time discount. We use the 5% rate. This is not so important because it's kind of dwarfed by this nu. Remember my Bellman equation here, my value function was discounted at rate R plus nu. So what is nu? Nu is the rate with which a cure and a vaccine will arrive. And we assume something between 1.5 years or 2 years, you will have a vaccine that then, you know, the problem will be solved. And therefore, you know, if you transform this nu into a rate, you can see that in terms of magnitude, it really dwarfs the R. So you're discounting at rate R plus nu. And finally, there's one more parameter. There is this L bar. We assume that the lockdown cannot be full, that there is a maximum lockdown rate that the policymaker can implement. And think of it like, you know, certain sectors of the economy have to keep working, like the police, the hospitals, the government, health, some food production and distribution. So we kind of did a quick back of the envelope calculation and ended up with an L bar of 70%. And I mentioned before the effectiveness of the lockdown. We start from a benchmark of half effective. So once in lockdown, you will reduce your contacts by half. And we start with the value of a statistical life equal to 20, which is kind of consistent with what Jones, Hall, and Klenow did. So it's a value that is very small, to tell you the truth, compared to value of statistical lives that are, first of all, what are the units? This means that each year of each death basically corresponds to 20 years of annual production for that person. Okay, so if I die and I had one, if I die today, to compensate my for my losses, you have to give me 20 years of my GDP, 20 of my yearly GDPs. Now, numbers in the literature of the value of a statistical life are much higher, roughly 5 times higher, I would say, maybe more in the range of 100. And the reason this number from Hall, Jones, and Klenow differs so much is basically because most of the fatalities in COVID are concentrated among very old agents who don't have that many years of residual life. But anyway, we're exploring, and we'll end up, I think now in a revision of this paper, increasing this value, probably by twice as much. Okay, but this is the benchmark parameterizations for what I'm going to show you next. And then I also have a lot of robustness checks for different parameterizations that I will not have time to show all of them today, but they're in the paper, and the paper is on our websites with appendices and even with codes. So this is easy access for anybody interested. Okay, so given the parameterization and the problem I described before, what is it that you do? You solve for the value function. That's what we have here. So on the right hand side, you see just example and using the value function. The function is value in terms of flow units. So a number of 3.5 means that this is 3.5 of GDP per year, the cost. So it's a pretty big cost. And this happens when the economy will be in a position where 100% of the agents are infected and nobody is susceptible. I mentioned to you that this square here in the bottom is the state space of the value function, okay? So actually it is here. So the state space is defined over the region of infected from 0 to 1, susceptible from 0 to 1, and the sum of the two cannot be bigger than 1. So you have this triangle, that's a state space. Now, what is this object here on the left? It's a policy function, which we represent as a heat map. A heat map means when you see yellow, it means lockdown is full, okay? Full yellow means full lockdown. Blue means little lockdown, so you can read it here. So if we position ourselves in a point of the state space, in this region, here for instance, you have a lot of susceptible and a very few infected, the optimal policy will tell you don't lock down. And I can tell you a little bit of the economics intuition for why you don't lock down here. Basically, you have to lock down. There's too few people. The benefit of locking down is very small and the cost is very high. Too few people are infected, very few people die, and locking down everybody is very costly. So in order to lock down, you need a combination for lockdown to be optimal in this framework. Oh, and by the way, this is the framework in which we're assuming that the policymaker has a serological test. So the lockdown is costly, but still you can release the recovered. So, you know, basically, I just want to show you the tools. The way this works is once you have solved the policy function on the left and the value function, you pick an initial condition in this plane, and then all the dynamics will be determined by the problem. No control here, then you will enter the yellow zone and you will control, and then at some point you will exit the yellow zone. So it's probably easier to see these trajectories by showing you some simulations, you know, some realizations in the time domain. So if I start the economy, this is a benchmark in which we assume, I like to think of this very much like Italy. There was no testing whatsoever, so tau is 0. Maybe Lombardy will be more precise. You start the economy with a 1% infected. So initially, so at 0, there is a 1% infected. And this policymaker doesn't do anything for 20 days. And then it enters a full lockdown up to roughly 70%. You know, it starts locking down at 20 days. It goes up very fast. It stays in full lockdown for about 2 weeks, and then gradually gets out of the lockdown. And at day 80, basically 2 months after beginning the lockdown, it releases the lockdown. So first, let's discuss the mechanics a little bit. How does this work? Well, in the absence of any control, and again, let me remind you, here we are assuming agents don't do any deliberate social distancing. So they behave a little bit like bacteria. So in the absence of any control, the red path would have occurred. You would have had a lot of infected. And because of a lot of infected, because of the congestion, you would have had a lot of dead people. Now here, the policymaker steps in when the infected reach about 10% and flattens the rate of the new infections. Big time. So, you know, the infected stays roughly constant and the number of deaths is decreased. Now let me compare this with the scenario in which I will allow, or let me make a final remark. A particular feature of this policy is that the policymaker waited kind of like 3 weeks from the initial outbreak of 1%. We could say, we could argue that this is counterfactual, that this is not what we saw, that in many places we saw a quick adoption of the lockdown. I'll get back to this later. Let me now show you what happens when there is a serological test. Now there are 2 lines in the lockdown diagram on the top. Why? Well, because the dashed line tells you what fraction of the population is, what is the lockdown rate, but the lockdown rate only applies to the susceptible and the infected, not to the recovered. So that the difference between these 2 lines is, you know, if you're recovered, you're not in lockdown. So that's why you can see initially they're on top of each other, but then the fraction of population in lockdown is more than the later lockdown because it's just, there's a group of people who go back to work. Those are the recovered. Now you can see how with this instrument of the testing, the policy is very different because it starts again at day 20, but before it stopped at date 80. And now it goes on until day 140, so much longer. Why did it stop earlier before? Well, it was too costly. The policymaker knew that a lot of people in lockdown were actually good to work, so it couldn't continue with this lockdown. It's too inefficient. The lockdown has a very big output cost. Oh, in our setup, we assume if you're in lockdown, your production is 0. So that's maybe not a good setup for economists, but, you know, and this is also easy to change. One could parameterize this differently, but that's just the benchmark we chose. So let me move on kind of quickly. So this is the testing. One can, of course, compare the 2 cases and come out with a measure of the welfare benefits of having the testing. It's pretty big. So having access to the
Francesco,
testing. Yes.
We have a clarification question from Charles. He's asking if infected is newly infected, like 10%.
Well, no, infected is a state variable. So it describes the stock of infected agents at each point in time, right? I dot is the flow of the new infected. So infected is a stock of infected at each point in time. So for instance, in this economy, you will reach a peak under no control of 30% infected at one point in time. That's not the cumulative. That's not, you know, I didn't plot the, I mean, you could think about at the end of the day, how many people after 2 years have been infected. That's not what you have. This is the stock of infected at a point in time. And the derivative of this object is the flow into the infected. So let me, you know, just mention that we have a lot of robustness checks that I don't have time now to enter, but basically we experiment with higher value of statistical life, slower diffusion of the virus, lower fatality rate. What I want to quickly discuss, because I think it's a very interesting policy, is the problem when we also allow the planner, endow the planner with an additional instrument that is a testing and tracing and quarantining agents that I mentioned before. Essentially, you catch a pool of infected and you place them into quarantine. So you take out of activities with other agents. Now, the key to this problem, I will not enter the technical details, which are very important and actually tricky, because if you look at this problem brute force, you will think you now have to deal with a three-dimensional state space. And we found a way to squeeze this into a two-dimensional state space under some assumptions, in particular assumptions of no congestion and the planner in the serological test. So what is key for this problem is how you model the cost for the planner of catching those infected agents. Okay, so you see from the value function, there are the same objects. These are the foregone output losses. These are the losses from output losses from placing agents into quarantine. There is a new loss that is due to the fact that you have to catch these T infected agents per period. That's a flow. Today we go out and we catch 10 infected. How costly is that? Well, that crucially depends on the technology that you have to find them. It's like, you know, it's like a search, directed search versus random search. If zeta is 0, there is this parameter that basically controls the effectiveness of the testing tool. If zeta is 0, testing when there are very few infected is incredibly costly because it amounts to random testing. So to find one guy out of 100 people, you have to run like, you know, a lot of tests. Let's say if instead zeta is 1, you have an incredibly effective tracing technology. I'm thinking of this technology like, you know, those apps and a good monitoring system like the one they used in South Korea, that they knew that an infection outbreak occurred in a church and or some you know religious gathering, and they knew exactly who was there, and they find all the people, they test them. So if you are, I mean, you can see it, if zeta is 1, you basically think about these parentheses, that you have to make, or tasks that you have to run to find one infected. If zeta is 1, this is the number 1. That's very effective. If zeta is 0, this is a huge number if I minus q is small. Okay, so, and therefore I will show you results under 2 extreme parameterizations. We also have computations for intermediate cases when the technology is very smart, that is zeta is 1, or when the technology is random search, zeta 0. Now, when zeta is 0, so you're searching at random, you're basically not using the tracing tool. It's too expensive. By the way, now the policy instrument is two-dimensional. You have the lockdown, you have the tracing, you know how many people you trace per period, and the value function. Now, the interesting policy is when you have a smart policy, so the zeta is 1. When zeta is 1, it becomes very effective to have this instrument. Let me zoom in this corner here, in this blue area. What happens is that because now the instrument for smart tracing is very effective, you basically can eradicate completely the disease in finite time. So you can see it here. The yellow means that the quarantine policy is active. So you start immediately and you take out all the infected in finite time, and the problem is solved. And in welfare terms, this is fantastic. Losses are reduced by a factor of 4, welfare losses. So this is very efficient. I'm probably close to being out of time, right? Hello?
Yeah, you still have a few minutes.
Okay, I would like to take these few minutes to discuss finally something that we worked, thanks to Andy Atkinson, to some interactions with Andy. So Andy was puzzled that our lockdown, as I showed you in the previous pictures, let me show them again. Our lockdown typically started some 20 days, much later than the outbreak occurred. And our outbreak is not small, it's a 1% of the population, which is like a big outbreak compared to many of the cases that we've seen across Europe and in the US. So what would justify like an earlier lockdown, like we saw in practice? So we explored this hypothesis that we name after Andy, since after all it was him who suggested it. What if the planner knows at time 0 when the outbreak occurs that in some periods, I'm using the math symbol mathcal T, in some periods, say in 2 months, a better technology will arrive. Now this creates an incentive to freeze the state, to lock down now so that you wait for an improved technology. It's a little bit like the timeout in basketball, I would say. Like, you know, you want to stop just now it's a terrible moment. You think that in 5 minutes you'll be somehow in better shape to deal with the same problem. So this creates a dynamic complementarity, which we solve by backward inductions. We have all the value functions I showed you before for all the different technologies. So basically we assume, what if 2 months from now, you will have the serological test and the TTQ, and today you don't. Then you just solve it backward, and it's very easy. And let me show you some results. I think my baseline results assume that I'm assuming in 60 days. So I'm assuming I start from an economy. For simplicity, I rule out congestion effects. So I just want to focus on the dynamics of the propagation of the virus. And assume initially I have no test to know whether a person has recovered as antibodies or not. And I'm assuming in 60 days, I will have a serological test and I will have a smart tracing technology, like some app to trace people and track them and possibly quarantine them. Now what happens is, I show you here in this picture. So basically, in the baseline case I showed you before, it's this red dashed line. There was no lockdown whatsoever. In the baseline case, if I assume that there is no congestion effect, so kappa is 0, the policymaker does not want to lock down because the cost of lockdown is too high. But now, the same setting, the same no congestion effect, knowing that in 60 days there will be this better technology, the policymaker immediately jumps into a full lockdown for the full 60 days. And then, you know, we'll do whatever is optimal to do after 60 days with the new technology. So this graph how this dynamic complementarity, the foretelling of a future improvement arriving, creates a big motive today for locking down. Let me say once more, a big cost of the lockdown, if you only have the lockdown, is that you have to stick to it for a long time, because you enter it today, and you know, if you release it in 2 weeks, you're back to square zero almost. So that's a big disadvantage of the lockdown. You're buying time almost for nothing. So with the dynamic complementarities, you're buying time for something very useful. That's what you're seeing here. And then, you know, we can explore, we can do some comparative statistics. For instance, if the better technology will arrive in 6 months, then basically you're not going to use the lockdown. When you see a lot of blue, it means no lockdown. But now let me show you how, as I bring the better technologies closer and closer, like 120 days, 90 days, 60 days, 30 days, the area, the region where you want to lock down now, even though you don't have the good technology now, is expanding, okay? That's the idea. This is a comparative static with respect to the horizon when the better technologies will arrive. So let me wrap up. What we propose here is a simple framework to analyze the trade-offs of the lockdown. And it's simple, as I mentioned, because among others, we assume there's no heterogeneity in the population. We assume there is no uncertainty on the parameters. That's also an important. We assume that agents there's no behavioral aspects here. We just look at the lockdown. If we release the lockdown, agents don't adjust their behavior. So it's simple, but it's not trivial because solving this was not easy, at least for us. So we quantify the foregone costs of the lockdown. They're big. You know, in the baseline case, we kind of quantify that the present value of foregone output of COVID after an outbreak of 1% with the serological test is about 8% of annual GDP. That's big. And that's a sum of the GDP lost and the lives lost. And something that we learned is that there are big benefits, very big benefits of having antibody tests and of having smart tracing technologies to deal with the disease. There are some open questions. There are many open questions. parameters. We're working on it right now, trying to refine our calibrations based on better measures that have been developed in these 3 months. A richer model. Our model is very simplistic, even in its economics. The cost of the lockdown have no scarring effects, right? I mean, you assume that if you release a lockdown, that locking down for 2 months is the same as locking down 1 month now and 1 month next year. That's probably not true. And we could also consider alternative matching frameworks, like abandoning the quadratic matching framework of the SIR model that I discussed. But I want to stop here, and perhaps we can discuss some of the questions from the audience. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot, Francesco. So I have a couple of questions, but let me start from, we have a question from Evanston Tan, which is related a little bit to what you discussed at the end, but from a different aspect. So you said what you did is like, let's suppose we know that in 2 weeks we have a cure. Evanston said, what if instead you could know that you shut down the economy for 1 week and then you reopen it and you're home free? And he's quoting the example of New Zealand.
Well, so I suppose in this model, if you only have the lockdown and you shut down the economy for 1 week, once you reopen, you will not be home free, because the lockdown is not sufficient to bring the infections to zero. So, let me use a figure. So in this model, the only way to eradicate, so let me go back to the dynamics of the system. Actually, I think, sorry, okay, this one. So what you need, so look at the following, I dot, so the infected go down at the rate gamma, so it's exponential decay. So assuming you have no new infections, you will still have a little bit of the old infected in the population. So the moment you release the lockdown, you're gonna be back to, another outbreak. Once you start, it's important that you keep it on until you reach some threshold that we could call herd immunity, which is typically in the SIR model will be given by gamma over beta. So that's a very low value for S to be reached. So really, one way to think about New Zealand within this model is that they locked down for 1 week, or South Korea for that matter. They locked down for 1 week, but they were good at using something like a quarantine tool, because you really have to remove the infected from their social interactions. So I minus Q, has to go to 0. And that's what you can do with a TTQ policy. You can never do that with the lockdown instrument.
So just to maybe very narrow technically complement what Francesco was saying, but it's kind of a model that many people use, so that's why it's useful. You see that in the Q dot equation, T, if you could really follow the person, that means that T could make a Q dot relatively large. So you could basically have a stock on quarantine that is equal to I, all the infected. So you literally put all the infected in quarantine. So the boundary is accessible. So you could access to basically 0. Now that's just the mathematics of equations. It's, these are approximations through a large population, but that's a reason why you get like approximately, that mathematically you get this kind of difference between whether the 0 is something that is achievable in finite time or not. There seems to be something kind of reasonable to it, but it's a bit of the mathematics of the simplification.
Thanks. So one question that I have is, so you said that you're going to do a reparameterization with a lower R0, which is beta in your, it's related to beta in your model, right? So yes. One thing that we noticed is that R0 is not fixed. So in a sense, as the pandemic has changed, people are more cautious, they wash their hands more often. So I don't know if this would have a big implication on your model having a time varying beta.
do you want to answer, Francesco? Sorry, I just jumped
Please
the
go
gun.
ahead. It's okay.
So for two reasons, we want to look at, so we are not modeling the equilibrium because I think at the end we want to know, given the externality, what will be the prescribed policy. So beta will be only in our setup interesting for the very, very beginning of the outbreak, because before either policies are in place or before the reaction from agents. So that's why, in some sense, we have a varying beta, because our expression for 1 minus theta L, which is sort of like what the beta is changing because of, in our setup, is because of the mandated lockdown. But what we want to know is what is sort of given to the planner, which is kind of the reproduction rate at the very beginning of the outbreak. But now there is more information, better information in terms of what people think that happens early on in past outbreaks, and also outbreaks that took place a little bit later on. And I think we were, our beta was kind of large. It has the effect also, if you look at our graphs, of producing, say, if the behavior would have not changed, then the herd immunity, well, let me just put it differently. If the behavior will not change also, this is another way of thinking about beta, the effect that beta will have, is that you will have essentially almost the entire population going through the disease. While if beta will be, so that's another way of thinking. It's the speed at which things happen, and also the size of the population that will be infected had behavior not changed. But so the change on beta that occurred naturally, we think that we are after the prescribed value that it should be, but we need to get the sort of, maybe put a quote unquote technological value from the very beginning of the outbreak, before the either mandated or the equilibrium reactions have taken place.
One question about the nice picture that you showed, Francesco. So the first picture that you showed, you have on one side a tridimensional graph of the value function, and on the left-hand side, the graph of that one. So this is just, I don't know if it's visualization or things. So when I look at the value function, so the colors are really shaded. So they smoothly transition from one color to the other. In the optimal policy, you have sort of this abrupt transition from one state to the other. It's just an illusion, or is something of the model? You see what I mean, right?
Right. So yeah, the optimal policy, if the control, if it was not quadratic, so remember the shape of the Hamiltonian, the form of the Hamiltonian, well, perhaps, so this is the Hamiltonian. If there was no quadratic in these terms here, then we would have known analytically that the policy had to be bang-bang because of the linearity. So that is, I think, what you're suggesting, that when you look at this figure here, sorry, I moved, sorry. That when you look at this figure, it is almost as if you're jumping from 0 here to 1, to the maximum.
Yeah.
And yes, I think that's inherited from that shape. It's not linear. So if it was linear instead of quadratic, it would have been literally bang bang, either blue or yellow. And it is not linear, but still it's very jumping. So you move very quickly from having no policy to having a full lockdown and back. And actually, since you asked me about the figure, I want to remark, because I see many problems these days being solved, of this type being solved with first order approach. And this is where the problem is tricky for us, because if you look at the value function, you see that this line here that I'm pointing with the cursor is the point where the value function is 0, because there is no infected. So if you are at I equals 0, the value function is 0. But if I is epsilon, your value function jumps. And in fact, unfortunately, this region is really the region we are interested in, because when the outbreak begins, you have a lot of susceptible and a very few infected. So these problems are tricky, and one has to be careful, because it is not easy to characterize this function in these points.
Thanks again, Francesco and Fernando and David. It's very early in the US, so thanks for taking the time of being with us today, and hope to see everybody back next week.
Thank you. Thank you, Hugo.
Bye, thanks.